And thank you for joining us. President Moon Jae-in is back in Seoul after 2 busy trips to North Korea and the US. He can be satisfied with having successfully put talks between the two sides back on track, with President Trump now declaring that a second summit with Kim Jong-un is in the works. We'll take another look back at what President Moon achieved from his most recent trip to New York, as well as what comes next with our guests in the studio later. But first, we catch up with the latest headlines, turning to Devin Whiting at the News Center. Devin?
Hi, Jang-ho. The UN Security Council met Thursday to discuss the positive developments recently in negotiations between North Korea and the U.S. But there was tension between the U.S. and North Korea's 2 allies, China and Russia, over whether the sanctions on the North should stay in place. Oh Jung-hee reports.
The 15 member nations of the UN Security Council gathered Thursday on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly to discuss North Korea. The meeting came after U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo accepted North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's invitation to Pyongyang, and after President Trump revealed that he received another letter from Kim. Against that backdrop, it was a standoff between the U.S. and North Korea's neighbors, China and Russia, over sanctions. Secretary Pompeo said they'll have to stay in place until North Korea denuclearizes, and he credited the sanctions for the progress made up till now.
We must not forget what's brought us this far, the historic international pressure campaign that this Council has made possible through the sanctions that it imposed. Enforcement of UN Security Council sanctions must continue vigorously and without fail until we realize the fully, final, verified denuclearization.
China and Russia, on the other hand, said the sanctions need to be eased. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi pointed out that one of the Security Council provisions allows sanctions to be modified if Pyongyang is found to be complying with them.
Given the positive developments, China believes that the Security Council needs to consider invoking in due course this provision to encourage North Korea and other relevant parties to move denuclearization further ahead.
And Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said sanctions can't become a, quote, instrument of collective punishment.
I'll just like to remind you that any negotiations are a two-way street. North Korea's towards gradual disarmament should be followed by easing of sanctions. There should be reaction towards every action.
North Korea promised it'll invite international experts when it dismantles its missile engine test site, and hinted it could get rid of its key nuclear complex once the U.S. takes corresponding measures. But differences remain between the U.S. and the 2 allies of the North over what comes next. Washington in favor of dialogue and sanctions, and Beijing and Moscow calling for rewards as the process goes forward. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
And at the UN General Assembly earlier this week, North Korea's Foreign Minister Lee Yong-ho was unusually busy. On Wednesday, he met with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who accepted North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's invitation to visit Pyongyang again. Lee also sat down with his counterparts from Japan, China, and Russia. It's rare for North Korea to hold meetings with foreign ministers on the sidelines of the General Assembly. Lee will be giving his own speech to the Assembly on Saturday. Observers say the North engaging in more dialogue with its neighbors is the result of positive developments on the Korean Peninsula achieved through the regime's summits with South Korea and the U.S. Kim Jong-un at last week's inter-Korean summit in Pyongyang announced some concrete steps he plans to take to denuclearize under certain conditions. That includes shutting down the regime's main nuclear complex. But a renowned nuclear scientist who's very familiar with the North's nuclear programs says the complex could maybe be used for peaceful purposes. Our Park Hee-jun reports.
Dr. Siegfried Hecker, an American nuclear scientist, says North Korea's conditional shutdown of its Yongbyon nuclear complex would be a very positive sign that demonstrates its willingness to denuclearize. Hecker made the remarks on Thursday during a special lecture hosted by the Yonsei Institute for North Korean Studies. He's visited the complex 4 times, and from what he's seen firsthand, it's functional with some relatively new facilities, which makes it quite a big concession.
If North Korea actually follows through with shutting down, and they said dismantle, that's a very big deal. That would be a huge step of showing that North Korea is actually serious about rolling back its nuclear program.
But he has doubts on whether North Korea will ever give it up. Hecker notes how the complex was an enormous investment for the regime, both in terms of money and pride. Instead, he suggests allowing the North to maintain it partially and convert it from military use to civilian purposes and space programs.
In my opinion, is the risk of letting them keep some of the civilian nuclear facility is worth the potential benefit by working jointly with them in those facilities, and it would be the best chance in terms of eventual verifications.
According to Hecker's 10-year framework, that needs to be achieved through a long process of negotiations that encourages North Korea to make such concrete steps. Under the phased approach, North Korea will be convinced to demilitarize its Yongbyon complex. And ultimately, Hecker says that will turn nuclear weapons from a treasured sword to an unnecessary burden that North Korea can let go. Park Hee-jun, Arirang News.
The two Koreas are holding a joint event next week in the North Korean capital, Pyeongyang, to celebrate the 11th anniversary of their 2007 summit agreement, dubbed the October 4th Declaration. The event was agreed upon today by the South and North Korean heads of the Inter-Korean Liaison Office. They met for 2 hours at the office in the Kaesong Industrial Complex north of the border. The celebration is to be held for 3 days from October 4th, with Seoul sending a 150-member delegation. Other details of the event will be ironed out through the Joint Liaison Office. The United States has sent back dozens of sets of South Korean soldiers' remains to their homeland. These remains had been found previously in a search operation in North Korea from 1996 to 2005 and had been identified as South Koreans through a joint forensic review. The U.S. Defense POW MIA accounting agency handed over the 64 sets of remains to South Korean representatives at a send-off ceremony on Thursday in Hawaii. The DPAA said it's the largest transfer of war remains the two allies have ever done. The repatriation ceremony is set to take place at Seoul Air Base on October 1st, which in South Korea is Armed Forces Day. In other news, data show Korean consumers are optimistic about the economy overall thanks to a rising stock market and a strong economy, and they're particularly optimistic about the housing market. Kim Ji-yeon reports.
South Korea's consumer sentiment rebounded for the first time in 4 months in September. Data released by the Bank of Korea on Friday shows its composite consumer sentiment index rose 2.5 points to 101.7, recovering from a dip last month when it fell below the 100 level, mainly due to grim unemployment figures released earlier this year. A reading above 100 means there are more optimists than pessimists about the economy. An official from the central bank attributed the rise to robust exports, an upbeat stock market, and a slowdown in price increases of food and other livelihood expenses. The official added that data suggests consumers think the worst is over, as the government has put forth measures to boost the job market and stabilize prices. The same data shows consumer sentiment on housing prices has climbed by 10 points to 119 this month, a near 3-year high. It cited rises in real estate prices in Seoul as well as prices of jeonse, a unique long-term rent in Korea in the form of a lump sum deposit, as the main reasons. It comes after the government unveiled measures this month on curbing speculative housing practices by levying heftier taxes on multiple homeowners and limiting the amount they can borrow from banks. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines.
In this section of today's show, we'll be debriefing President Moon Jae-in's trip to the US this week. And to help us do that, we have two guests in the studio with us today. First, to my right, we have Professor Kim Hyun-wook from the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. It's good to have you with us again today.
Thank you.
And to my left, we have our Chief Blue House correspondent, Shin Se-min, who returned with the president just last night after following him around as part of the Korean press pool. Thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Now, but before we go into this discussion, we'll start by taking a brief look back into the highlights from President Moon's trip, one of his highlights anyway, his speech at the UN General Assembly on Wednesday. We have some excerpts ready. Let's take a quick listen.
지난 1년 한반도에는 기적 같은 일이 벌어졌습니다. 역사상 처음으로 북한의 지도자가 군사 분계선을 넘어 판문점에 내려왔습니다. 싱가포르 센토사 섬에서는 역사적인 북미 정상회담이 열렸습니다. 김정은 위원장과 나는 전쟁의 그림자를 걷어내고 평화와 번영의 시대를 다짐했습니다. 한반도는 65년 동안 정전 상황입니다. 전쟁 종식은 매우 절실합니다. 평화체제로 가기 위해 반드시 거쳐야 할 과정입니다. 앞으로 비핵화를 위한 과감한 조치들이 관련국 사이에서 실행되고 종전선언으로 이어질 것을 기대합니다. 이제 국제사회가 북한의 새로운 선택과 노력에 화답할 차례입니다. 김정은 위원장의 비핵화 결단이 올바른 판단임을 확인해 주어야 합니다. 북한이 항구적이고 공고한 평화의 길을 계속 갈 수 있도록 이끌어 주어야 합니다.
So that was President Moon Jae-in at the UN General Assembly there. So, let me start with you. You followed President Moon around on his most recent trip to the US, including, I believe, the UN General Assembly there as well. You weren't there with him for North Korea, but you are following his movements closely at the media press center as well. It's really been quite a busy schedule. What, for you, has been the highlights of his schedule over the last few weeks?
Right, no doubt it's been a non-stop diplomacy for President Moon Jae-in over the past couple of weeks. And two things I want to point out. One, getting an absolute confirmation from North Korean leader Kim Jong-un saying of his commitment to putting down the regime's nuclear weapons, and which is leading to a round two of that Sentosa meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump. And another is officially confirming once and for all that the related parties are all on the same page when it comes to declaring the official end of the Korean War. And yes, President's schedule in both Pyongyang and New York clearly reflects such a push, with President Moon has gaining support for his administration's drive for a nuclear-free Korean peninsula and reaffirmed the world that the ending of the Korean War in the near future, which was the first time that the South Korean president had brought that issue up on the UN stage.
So, Professor Kim, let me turn to you now. So, President Moon has put a lot on his shoulders trying to mediate between North Korea and the US. With his recent two trips, do you think he succeeded in his aims to try and be that mediator?
Yes, the US, North Korea, they re-entered into the negotiations. Two ministers of foreign affairs, Pompeo and Arirang, met together. And Pompeo's visit to Pyongyang is now scheduled, maybe sometime near, maybe next week or something. The story is that before the Pompeo's visit to Pyongyang, which was canceled last time, the U.S. kept on asking the North Korea to submit the declaration of its nuclear capabilities, which was rejected by North. And in return, the U.S. requested the complete destruction of the Yongbyon facility, nuclear facility, which was also, rejected by North Korea. But this time, by North-South Korean leaders summit meeting, there was, agreement about how to proceed in denuclearization. If there is some corresponding measures by the United States, North Korea would be willingly to destroy its Yongbyon facilities. Of course, maybe the U.S. would not think it's enough, because U.S. has been requesting the declaration of nuclear, capabilities by the North first before it gives some measures to the North. So we don't know what details would be met by two sides, but at least the President Moon successfully made two parties come to the negotiation again.
So they're back in negotiation, but as you said, details are quite short at the moment. Those details seem to be a concern not only with the experts, but with, I think, the reporters there as well when you were there. What were some of the concerns that you felt that the foreign press and the Korean press had there when they were seeing President Moon and President Trump in their negotiations and such?
I think and time again are a lot of the reporters' expectations of having the detailed discussions, a detailed plan from the leaders of both South and North Korea and the United States president had not been met quite efficiently till this point. But the fact that such a development on North Korea is taking place in such a short amount of time already is an assertion and an indication to a lot of the people, including the presidential press corps, that perhaps the process on bringing the Korean peninsula closer to peace is on the right track. So some of the presidential press pool who had accompanied President Moon both to Pyongyang and to New York this time say that the general atmosphere during the summits with respective leaders in both sides had been held in a very positive manner, so to speak. But concerns, though, have kept coming in from the conservative media in the U.S., still skeptical of whether the deal between both Pyongyang and Washington would unfold in a positive direction. So that interview President Moon had held with the conservative-leaning Fox News during his stay in New York this week, it was seen as an effort to quell such looming skepticism head-on. And the responses following that interview, of course, added to the view of him being the ultimate mediator, with President Trump even calling him the only person who can solve this problem.
So I'm not sure if you saw that Fox interview. He tried to quell some of those concerns there. But do you think he can, President Kim, do you think he was able to convince those skeptics that, progress was being made and that the differences between North Korea and the US on the details can be bridged at some point?
I don't know. I haven't been to Washington, D.C. after his visit to New York. So I don't know how the elites in D.C., policymakers and experts in D.C., their opinions changed. I don't know. But I think at least it clearly changed the atmosphere in South Korea. A lot of conservatives, politicians, I don't think their criticism has, is continuing. Their criticism has pretty much got weaker after, after Moon Jae-in's visit to New York. But I think, very recent, expert of U.S. who was visiting Seoul met the same period that, Moon Jae-in was visiting in New York. He was still very critical about the situation, not critical about President Moon Jae-in, but critical about Kim Jong-un and Trump. President Trump would make the U.S. forces in Korea very much in a risky situation. If things get better, the threats of North Korea gets much weaker. This process of denuclearization and peace process continues. President Trump might think that U.S. forces in Korea staying in South Korea would not be necessary. That's first concern he gave to me. A second concern is that Kim Jong-un realistically not possible and intentionally not willing to give up his nuclear weapons. So those two things were the concerns that the elites in D.C. had.
Yes, for example, as well, we in last week's meeting between the two Koreas, the North Korea agreed to take further steps towards denuclearization, but only if the US make corresponding measures. Despite all this progress that has been made in the last few days about the second summit between Trump and Kim, there's still the details about what those corresponding measures are haven't really been fleshed out, it seems, not in public anyway. Is that a concern at all, do you think?
I think Pompeo is going to Pyongyang, and that means that they almost finished coordinations about what the corresponding measures should be and what kinds of denuclearization measures by the North Korea has to be given to the United States. Now, by the agreement between North and South Korean leaders, what has come out of the agreement is that North Korea would be destroying Yongbyon nuclear facility, but that measure is not the same value as the peace declaration. So I think there should be some coordinations between two things. If there comes up the peace declaration as the corresponding measures, I think North Korea has to give something more than just destroying the Yongbyon facilities. And I think they come up with agreement what those two things should be, because Pompeo is going to Pyongyang.
So that's, I guess, and that's the next question I was going to ask you, Semyon. So what comes next? Obviously, we know Pompeo is going to Pyongyang. What do we know? What else do we know that is going to happen next?
I mean, now that President Moon Jae-in had come to have done his part as a mediator, keeping North Korean leader Kim and U.S. President up to date on the latest process, now it's more like a waiting to see what would unfold. Like Professor Kim had just said, we know that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will be visiting North Korea next month, which begins next week already, while hinting at another beginning, saying that the world stands at the, quote, dawn of a new day in relations with the North. So many are watching to see whether Pompeo will come out of his third official visit as the top diplomat of U.S. with some of the details as to when or where the two leaders will be having their round 2 of the summit.
So the round 2 of the summit, President Trump and Kim could be having at some point. Pompeo has said it could happen in October, but more likely to happen in November. What do you reckon, Professor Kim? Where are you going to place your bet on? Which date would you place your bet on for the next? Yes, for the next Trump-Kim summit.
Well, but maybe it would be good for President Trump if he hold that meeting before the midterm election. Kim Jong-un and President Trump meet together with a very good, successful outcome about the denuclearization. Stipulated in their agreement, it would be good. I mean, help out the victorious result in the midterm election. But realistically, the schedule is very tight. I mean, early October next week, possibly, Pompeo is going to Pyongyang, and he comes back 3 weeks. They have to have at the summit meeting, which I don't think is possible, realistically possible. So I think, as Secretary Pompeo has said, maybe it's more likely that they will hold that meeting after the midterm election, maybe early November. I think so.
So there are certainly some hurdles to overcome. But Sam, I understand that South Korea, on their part, they're not going to be staying still while this is happening, while they wait for US and North Korea talks to continue. I mean, can you tell us what the South Korean government is now going to do, what steps they're going to take next?
Right, while President Moon Jae-in was busy brokering a deal between the two sides, North Korea and the U.S., the staffers here in South Korea had been busy getting the ball rolling in terms of carrying out the promises that the two leaders of the two Koreas had been making in the past couple of months. The Committee on Carrying Out the Inter-Korean Joint Declarations, including the first encounter in April, held their own first meeting today after having changed their name to the Inter-Korean Summit Declaration Fulfilling Committee, and chaired by the Summit Preparatory Committee Chair Im Jong-suk, who also doubles a role as the Presidential Chief of Staff. The committee had gone over ways to kickstart some of the promises made by the leaders while making sure that the processes run smoothly. And of course, there cannot be a better proof of North Korea's change of heart and denuclearization than seeing those promises being carried out by the two Koreas.
Professor, what do you see South Korea and President Moon's role now that he's successfully mediated between the North Korea and the US? I mean, what does South Korea need to continue doing?
Well, I think for now, President Moon has to see how things evolve between the US and North Korea about the denuclearization issues. That's something that has to have some kinds of outcome which would lead to some corresponding measures by the United States, whether it would be the peace declaration or some other measures which is good for the two countries' relations. Second thing, I'm kind of worrying about the role of China. I think maybe yesterday, Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that China prefers going back to six-party process, which is very remote idea in reality right now. There is a bilateral deal between Trump and Kim, and China thinks that six-party process is good because China does not want to be passed out of isolated from the current move towards denuclearization. So this kind of position of China is making me worry about the role of China in the future being a spoiler rather than, a positive, contributor to the denuclearizing issues. So this kind of things, we have to deal with China, talk and make more diplomatic efforts with China so that China would be moving towards a positive role rather than negative role.
I mean, but why do you think China suddenly has gotten involved? Because China so far has kind of stayed out of things and let the US and North Korea sort it out by themselves. Are they trying to be a spoiler now? Is it now that just the timing, do you think?
I think, maybe China would not be involved in the peace declaration, but I think ultimately China would be a member for the peace treaty. Peace treaty is not just a peace treaty. It has a lot of articles. They have to come up and talk about and discuss and what should be the articles of peace treaty. And China definitely would like to put in the contents that would be good for the interest of China. For example, China might think that, okay, now the peace in the Korean Peninsula, why do we need US forces in South Korea? And the peace treaty situation would make the US and China conflict again in the Korean Peninsula, which is no good for the current situations of the Korean Peninsula. And that kind of thing is something that we need to deal with from now on.
We'll have to keep a close eye on that. Well, that's where we'll wrap things up. Thank you both for coming in, and we appreciate your time and your insights.
Always a pleasure.
And that brings our show to a close. I'll be back next week with more analysis and breakdowns of the day's top stories. Thank you for watching and hope you have a good end to your week. Goodbye.
On Jeju-do Island, our FM frequencies are 88.7 in Jeju City, 88.1 in Seogwipo City, and 101.9 MHz in Daejeong area, which is in the Jeju Global Education City. And through the satellite radio Sirius XM, you can listen to us on channel